Ok, penso che possiamo cominciare. Good afternoon, welcome everyone. I'm Giulio Tatasciore, research fellow in early modern history here at the University of Salerno, and I will take only a few minutes to introduce our guest and to clarify the context in which this seminar take place. First of all, allow me to say how grateful we all are to share this afternoon with JoEllen DeLucia. It is a great opportunity, I think, not only to hear from a brilliant scholar in the field of English literature and Gothic studies, but also to react against the difficulties due to the pandemic by establishing new networks between institutions from all around the world, and by starting new dialogues between scholars from different generations, academic fields, and perspectives. And I express this appreciation, I'm sure, on behalf of the entire scientific committee of the research group Immaginari, Literature, Entertainment, and Visual Culture. A scientific committee which includes myself, Daniele Di Bartolomeo from University of Teramo, Gianluca Fruci from University of Pisa, Carmine Pinto and Agnese Silvestri from University of Salerno. As a matter of fact, this seminar is part of the numerous activities held by Brigantaggio Revisited, a research project financed by the Italian government and coordinated by Professor Carmine Pinto. This project involves the University of Salerno as a principal investigator and University of Bari, Catania, and Teramo. In this research framework, our little group aims to study the cultural construction and the ways of mediatization of brigands and brigandage, with particular regard to visual culture, literature, and entertainment in 18th and 19th century Europe. So we have conceived this seminar as a step of a collective project that will lead us to organize a conference entitled Transmedia Brigands, Narrations, Visual Culture, and Communicative Networks. This conference is scheduled for October 28 and 29 here at Salerno University, and aims to study, starting from a transnational and diachronic perspective, the interactions between visual and literary culture in the representations of brigands and banditry. Today, JoEllen DeLucia will help us to understand some of these evolutions by analyzing it in a paper entitled Banditry in 18th Century British Print Culture. JoEllen DeLucia is a professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at Central Michigan University. And her research focuses on the literature of the long 18th century. And at CMU, she teaches a range of courses from introductory gender studies and writing courses to advanced courses on British literature and women's writing. As a matter of fact, her book, A Feminine Enlightenment, British Women Writers and the Philosophy, argues that women writers shaped conversations regarding the role of sentiment and gender in Enlightenment narratives of imperial development. And in this book, JoEllen DeLucia, she puts novels and poems by 18th century women writers in conversation with Scottish Enlightenment theories of social, economic, and aesthetic progress. But also building on her interest in global approaches to literature, JoEllen DeLucia has also co-edited an essay collection entitled Migration and Modernities, the State of Being Stateless, in 2019. Portions of her current research project on the radical bookseller George Robinson's media network and Romantic era literature have appeared in several reviews, and I just like to remind here her paper on the European Romantic Review entitled The Hounds of the Banditti, Transnationalism and Mediation in George Robinson's publishing network, which is the paper that gave us the idea of getting in touch with her. I've already talked too much, so once again, we are delighted to have you here in Salerno online, dear JoEllen, and I'm very pleased to let you have the floor.
Thanks so much for that really kind introduction. And thank you so much for the research group for inviting me. And I have a lot to learn since my focus is mostly on English texts. And I also wanted to really briefly thank my colleague from history, Doina Harsani, who's here today, because she's given me like a bunch of resources about bandits in the Napoleonic era that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to easily access. So I just wanted to thank her quickly. So here I go. Please let me know, because I'm sharing my slides, I can't easily see the chat. So please just interrupt me if something goes wrong or you have a question. All right. So the most influential and popular Gothic novel of the late 18th century, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, takes place in France and Italy in 1584. Yet the value of this date as a historical marker or an interpretive tool lies not in its accuracy, but in what it says about the Gothic's strange relationship to history. Known for being particularly unreliable, the dates in Gothic novels gesture toward vaguely medieval and early modern settings and rarely note any historical particulars. In fact, temporal distortions serve as standard genre markers for Gothic fiction, distinguishing it from realist and historical fictions. One such temporal anomaly found in The Mysteries of Udolpho and many other Gothic fictions of the same period are the presence of banditti. Standard figures within Gothic landscapes, banditti stalk the orphan heroines through whatever mountain range they may be lost within, or kidnap them from ruined abbeys and castles. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word bandito, B-A-N-D-E-T-O, first appeared in English texts in 1594. Thomas Nash's 1594 picaresque novel, The Unfortunate Traveler, defines, quote, the banditos as certain outlaws that lie betwixt Rome and Naples. However, the collective singular, banditti, a corruptive form of the Italian banditti with a 1T, did not appear in English until the 17th century, primarily in modern histories of Italy and France, and then later towards the 1650s and 60s criminal biographies. And here's some slides. Oh, is it not forwarding? Oh, here we go. Here's a slide from 18th century collections online. I didn't make this graph. The database generates it for you now. That illustrates its word frequency. And so in the corpus of text, this shows how frequently the word banditti appears in English texts. And we see it really spiking towards the end of the 18th century. However, I do want to say, I think this graph can be a little bit deceiving because here you're dealing with about 200 texts, and here there's some like 30 or 40,000. So the frequency can be a little bit off. And here's one other slide I'd like to show you. This comes from, these are standard corpuses that British literary scholars use. This is the 17th and 18th century Burney newspaper collection. It's probably the largest collection of British newspapers that's been digitized. And you can see here on the right a graph of the frequency which the word banditti appears in this. I think it's a corpus of about 1,000 different English newspapers. And then here, this is actually the graph on the right is actually the popularity of the term. And here, I think there's this is a corpus of about 200 newspapers again. And then here you go up to many more text. So I don't know how useful these graphs are, but I thought they were an interesting new feature of these databases that kind of spoke to the popularity significance of this word and the conceptual weight it starts to carry in English. So banditti as a concept or figure representing all those outside the law, regardless of their geographical location, did not take hold in English until well after the 1584 date Radcliffe assigns to Udolpho. and did not begin to appear with any significant frequency until the end of the 18th century. The popularity of banditti in text at the end of the 18th century seems to position them as a byproduct of the consolidation of European nation states, and as such, much more modern than pre-modern figures. It's easy to dismiss banditti as just another Gothic anachronism. However, if instead of reading them as merely conjuring Gothic atmosphere or embodying an unnamed other, we situate them within a larger Anglophone print culture, which includes plays, novels, magazines, newspapers, travel narratives, and even engravings and paintings, a much richer picture emerges. Reading across media and genres places banditti within a developing transnational aesthetics, one that serves as an alternative to the more documented and celebrated nation-based aesthetic structures that have been linked by critics from Ian Watt to Benedict Anderson and Jacques Rancière to realist and historical fiction. By tracking the banditti throughout late 18th century print culture, we see them as figures that articulate the mobile and intercultural qualities of a transnational modernity. As standard elements of the Gothic landscape, banditti are frequently listed alongside ruined castles, found manuscripts, secret passageways, and locked chests as part of a Gothic formula, because Gothic is really formula fiction. Denied the depth and complexity of the heroines who are often the focus of most literary critics' enquiries, bandits and brigands have been rendered invisible in literary studies of the Gothic. Important critics of Radcliffe's fiction, such as E.J. Cleary, tend to read banditti as triggering in British readers a sense of estranged recognition. In other words, as geographically and temporally distant figures, banditti function in Gothic novels as an acceptable channel through which women could recognize their own experience of patriarchal oppression within the bourgeois British family. Gothic banditti, so in this case, have served as a metaphor for the female heroine's psychological trauma and domestic terrors. They gained autonomy, at least for me, when I began reading Gothic serial fiction in magazines of the late 18th century, particularly the Ladies magazine. When reading one serial fiction, Monks and Robbers, which was published very oddly over the course of 11 years in the magazine, I noticed the Gothic phrase haunts of banditti, which I had always associated with Gothic novels, appearing in not just the serial fiction, but in news reports of insurrectionist criminals and rebels in Italy, Scotland, Egypt, Ireland, the West Indies, as well as London. And here's a slide illustrating this. You can see here on the left is just an example of a table of contents from the Ladies magazine. And so you can see here, I think it's item 14, you have the Monks and Robbers serial fiction. You can see the kind of content it ran alongside, and then it always concluded with a foreign and home news reports. And so you can see a few months later, or actually a year later, and the same time the serial fiction is running, you can see an account on the right, and this is from the home news report of insurrectionists and rebels in Granada and in St. Lucia. And you see here the word, if you look about halfway down, you see the banditti have likewise been overcome and some of their chiefs killed. And so I started to kind of track through this other magazine database that's called 18th Century Journals, examples of how banditti were being represented in literary text versus how they were represented in the news reports. So reading across genres in media invested banditti with the depth and complexity that they lacked when encountered solely within a 3-volume novel. Similarly, the frequency with which banditti appeared in the news reports of the Ladies magazine generated new questions for me about the relationship between politics, globalization, and Gothic aesthetics. Today, I'd like to discuss potential ways I might extend this initial research. And this is something I've been working on really only for about a month. So I'm sure there's lots of problems with it and lots of questions that you might ask. So I'm happy to be able to share this. My talk today primarily focuses on the banditti within Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. I read her novel alongside news reports of banditti written by her spouse, William Radcliffe, who wrote for and edited the radical newspaper, the Daily Gazetteer and Advertiser from 1790 to 1793, which is the same exact period in which Radcliffe was composing Udolpho, her most famous novel. In an extended version of this paper, what I'd like to do is also consider her subsequent novel, The Italian, against his work for another newspaper, the English Chronicle. So this is the second part of my paper here. So the intermedial qualities of Radcliffe's Mistress Udolpho are undeniable, and other people have talked about them, not about the newspapers, but about the way in which she deals with art and poetry in her fiction. So although critics have not focused on her work's relationship to newspapers and more popular forms of print media, significant attention has been paid to her engagements with painting and canonical poetry. She cites 18th century poetry, both within the diegesis and paratext of her novels. She loves like Edmund Spenser, Ariosto, Petrarch. Her frequent quotations, she loves Shakespeare the most. Her frequent quotations of Shakespeare have been read by Deirdre Lynch as an effort to position her Gothic romances within a developing British canon. Her narrator also uses the paintings of Salvador Rosa and Claude Lorraine as references in the novel's extensive landscape depictions. Rosa's paintings in particular, which she talks a lot about, become touchstones for the novel's imagining of banditti. One of the first references to banditti comes in the narrator's description of the reaction of the heroine's father to the French Alps. And I included the text of this quotation here because the temporal jumps are very interesting and strange, at least to me. The narrator tells readers that this was such a scene as Salvador would have chosen had he then existed for his canvas. Saint Aubert, impressed by the romantic character of the place, almost expected to see banditti start from behind some projecting rock. This early reference articulates the strange temporal placement of banditti within the novel. The novel's third-person narrator, who seems to describe events from the vantage of the late 18th century, imagines the landscape as a 17th century Rosa painting, but then attributes this vision to Saint Aubert, the heroine's father, who in 1584 would have no knowledge of the painter Rosa or the banditti he depicted. And I wanted to include with this, of course, one of the Rosa images that were so popular at the end of the 18th century. Then British artists also made engravings of them. They were all the rage in vogue. Radcliffe's other acknowledged sources reinforce the intentionally anachronistic character of banditti within the novel. Radcliffe references in textual notes not histories of Italy, but contemporary travel accounts. For instance, Hester Thrale Piazzi's travel narrative, Observations and Reflections Made in the Course of a Journey Through France, Italy, and Germany, which is published in 1789, describes Piazzi's journey in the 1780s, and it was a very important source for Radcliffe's descriptions of Italy, as Mariana Desio has documented. Piazzi uses the word banditti only once, though, in a description of why she avoided visiting 18th century San Marino. Radcliffe's most direct encounters with banditti in print likely came from 18th century newspapers. Although critics have not paid much attention to her interactions with contemporary news, which I think is kind of strange because her spouse, William Radcliffe, worked for the Gazetteer and Daily Advertiser as a parliamentary reporter and later as an editor during the same period in which Radcliffe was writing The Mysteries of Udolpho. Richter Norton, who is Radcliffe's most recent and popular biographer, suggests that William Radcliffe was likely selected as the editor because of his background as a translator. He was a failed lawyer, and so he began to his career translating travel narratives from French into English. So this enabled him to quickly translate the debates of the French Assembly, which were a major feature in the Daily Gazetteer. An early biographer of Radcliffe, another one, T. Telford Noon, has described Radcliffe as claiming she only turned to novel writing to keep her occupied in the evenings when her husband was working for the Gazetteer. Published thrice weekly, this newspaper, as its title indicates, balanced ads with national and international news. I hope you can kind of see how the newspaper works. A standard front page of it is on the right, and you can see how there's all these theater and book advertisements, and then it advertises society meetings, and later on it goes into pretty extensive parliamentary reporting, and then another section on the French Assembly. So about half the paper's contents are devoted to ads, plays at Covent Garden and Drury Lane, newly published books, lottery tickets, perfume, rental properties, servants, even auctions. The other half featured William Radcliffe's reports from the House of Lords and the House of Commons, long and sympathetic accounts of the French National Assembly, and letters to the editor on local crime and national politics. Within several reports of the National Assembly, there are embedded stories of banditti who are hired or supported, usually by royalists. And in one report, they even, quote, hoisted the white cockade after routing Republican troops. However, the banditti did not always gesture within the newspaper towards a coherent political position. There's tons of accounts of royalist banditti in the reports from the French Assembly, but they also register in different ways. And this blow up on the left isn't great, but this is one of William Radcliffe's parliamentary reports describing a speech Edmund Burke gave about the French Convention. So, okay. In a report of 1793, and this is the debate that I tried to blow up a little bit on the left-hand side, between the liberal Sir Charles James Fox, who the paper explicitly supports. The paper talks a lot about how great Fox is, and the conservative Edmund Burke, who is always Fox's opponent. Fox proposes that the British king should negotiate with the French Assembly to avert the miseries of war. And then this is standard Burke on the left-hand side. Always his rhetoric is so, they always describe it as ornamental. Burke argues vehemently against this course of action, claiming that, quote, the convention is composed of men who did not possess 1 shilling of property, and who, as they had nothing to lose, would not be very averse to war with this country. It was a republic of robbers, a horde of banditti, a den of thieves. It was contagious to approach them. He shuddered at the idea. He deprecated it. His blood ran cold in his view. Oh, that should be his veins, as he often thought of it. Similarly, the newspaper also describes Irish banditti, and this happens in the ladies' magazine too. Irish banditti, it's code in English newspapers and magazines for Irish Republicans. This newspaper describes Irish banditti as causing alarm in the counties of Kilkenny and Carlow. The banditti also function, at least superficially, in apolitical ways. A report from March 7th, 1793 describes banditti breaking into an architect's house in London. The term is also used in a report of court-martialed British soldiers who the paper identifies as, quote, infesting London streets. And this is from 1790. Although it would be impossible and likely foolhardy to use the banditti in the Gazetteer to flesh out a coherent politics for Anne Radcliffe, the banditti found in William Radcliffe's parliamentary reports do give Radcliffe's anachronistic banditti different coordinates in space and time, and suggest that the Gothic aesthetics her novels develop engage with global histories in ways that have gone unacknowledged. Admittedly, I haven't wholly figured out how this works. I'm just beginning this part of the project. However, I have found examples from the newspaper that bear an uncanny resemblance to events in Radcliffe's novel. For example, in a report from March 23rd, 1790, the paper describes the depredations committed by banditti in Brussels that were raised and instigated by those dreading the spread of democracy. The paper describes banditti as preparing gibbets for known Democrats who escaped to Ghent just in time. Emily, Udolpho's heroine, also encounters abandoned gibbets early on in her journey through the Alps, in a spot that to her, it seems, the very haunt of banditti. She describes, and this is a passage that I always find very curious and I always come back to. She describes a gibbet standing on a point of rock near the entrance of this pass and immediately over one of the crosses she had before observed. She continues to describe these elements of the landscape as hieroglyphs that told a plain and dreadful story. And I always wonder how hieroglyphs can tell a plain and dreadful story. It always seems paradoxical to me. But these hieroglyphs are never mentioned again, and for me have always remained more inscrutable than plain. But the story from the Gazetteer provides one potential translation. Banditti within the novel, Udolpho, are often difficult to recognize. Their stories are uncertain and half told, and the newspaper seems to restore some of that. Early in the novel, Emily's father mistakes her suitor and eventual husband, Valancourt, for a robber, a banditti, and actually shoots him. Hundreds of pages of the novel are also dedicated to a discussion of whether her aunt's new Italian husband, Signor Montoni, is a captain of banditti or a gentleman who rightfully owns a house in Venice and an ancient castle in the Apennines. Even before Montoni marries her aunt, this wealthy French widow, Madame Chiron, rumors circulate in France that Montoni is not the rightful owner of his properties. And there's much discussion, though, how no one would ever confront him about this because of his fierce countenance, his, really scary face, which is just talked about time and time again. However, fear prevents these rumors from ever becoming more than whispers. Once Montoni marries Emily's aunt, he takes both women into Italy, eventually imprisoning them in Udolpho. Scores of mysterious men soon arrive at the castle, speaking what Emily describes as bad Italian, and with, quote, a singularity in their dress and a certain fierceness in their air. Emily she really hesitates for a long time, about 400 pages, to name them as banditti. But in a strange moment of projection into the aesthetic realm, she decides to sketch them for banditti amid the mountain view of her picture. And here's a quotation. And here's also an early engraving from The Mysteries of Udolpho. It's an 1804 edition published by George Robinson, who was Radcliffe's publisher. And it shows, in terms of the singularity of dress, I thought it gave you a good idea of how readers were invited to imagine these figures. So after she reports on the arrival of this strange group of men to her aunt, who has none of Emily's hesitancy or delicacy, accuses her new husband of designs that, quote, do not serve the state, and asks him if he is, quote, captain of banditti, plundering and laying waste to the surrounding country. As in the novel, the gazetteer also struggles in separating banditti from legal and legitimate political and military actors. And I found this example quite recently. I don't know as much about the East India Company as I should. I don't know if anyone here might, but I'm going to try to walk us through this because this next example comes from the trial from William Radcliffe's reporting on the trial of William Hastings, which is the longest impeachment trial in British history. And there's just tons of information and documents surrounding his actions in India. So in the newspaper's reporting on the trial of William Hastings, banditti appear in colonial India and are used to justify and excuse actions that would otherwise be deemed illegal. The March 8th, 1790 edition of the paper published a petition from a Colonel Williams, who was under Hastings, who was one of the officers serving under Hastings, arguing against the negative depiction of his character in the articles of impeachment against Warren Hastings. Within a number of charges related to the brutal military actions of the East India Company and its forced revenue collection in the province of Gorakhpur, the 13th article of Hastings' impeachment accused Colonel Williams of executing without trial Raja Mustafa Khan, a Mughal prince, who resisted Hastings' orders and was reportedly able to raise as many as 10,000 men and horse against the East India Company. It's really interesting to me that instead of Williams denying his actions in Khan's execution, which happened without trial, his petition, which he wrote and somehow got published in the paper, rested on the idea that Mustafa Khan was not a man of rank as described in the official and public impeachment articles, but instead, quote, the head of a banditti that infested the district, a common robber. Khan's status as either aristocratic Raja or stateless and rankless banditti determines not just the legality of Colonel Williams' actions, but his reputation in British society. Although the House of Commons debated the merits of Colonel Williams' petition, it was withdrawn because of technicalities. The questions of Khan's legal status and relationship to the state were never adequately addressed. Despite this example of Khan serves to illustrate how Gothic aesthetics were often used to create unlikely transnational connections, joining Indian princes, Irish revolutionaries, and French and Italian peasants. The banditti framework also helped to erase or render invisible histories and cultural knowledge that did not fit into narratives of the developing nation state, and often by extension, its colonial projects. Radcliffe's novel might be understood of participating in this dynamic. And I'm trying to think about how these two moments might go together. I'm still not sure if they do. But once Emily's belief is confirmed after 2 volumes, 400 pages of the novel, that Montoni, quote, really had commenced to be captain of banditti, the narrator very strangely steps in to explain that actually Emily's supposition, however natural, was in part erroneous, for she was a stranger to the state of this country. The narrator goes on to explain that Montoni is not a captain of banditti, which seems anachronistic, but a captain of condottieri, a term formidable all over Italy for a period which concluded in the earlier part of the 17th centuries. And we have these like 3 pages of history that don't appear anywhere else in the novel. And then Montoni is referred to as a banditti again. This moment in the novel, which functions almost as a footnote, deserves more attention than I can give it today, but we again find the 18th century narrator intervening and pointing out how a character's anachronistic perceptions have distorted the narrative. So just about a page of conclusion. Reading banditti in Radcliffe's fiction against contemporary newspapers may not ultimately help clarify her politics, which have been debated in literary criticism for decades. However, reading banditti across media and genres does help us understand more about the reach and import of the Gothic aesthetic she pioneered. In Jacques Rancier's Politics and the Aesthetic, he argues for art is key to political change, claiming that, quote, an aesthetic politics always defines itself by a certain recasting of the distribution of the sensible, a reconfiguration of perceptual forms. Aesthetic practices, especially when repeated across media forms, as in the case of banditti, can reconfigure perceptions of time and space, make visible some modes of being and hide others. Rancière singles out 19th century realism as leading to a more democratic regime of arts, one that made the experiences of everyday people markers of modernity. Gothic fiction certainly granted banditti a new visibility, magnifying their presence in print. In addition to Radcliffe's fictions and the handful of news accounts today, there are hundreds of Gothic novels published between 1780 and 1820 that feature banditti. And these are just examples from another corpus that I often use. The Corvi collection is this big, huge collection of Minerva Press novels, which are a really early commercial press that published mainly romance novels and Gothic novels. And these are just 2 examples. But some of the more popular novels, there's banditti in all of these novels, but some of the more popular ones even use their term in their titles. Here we have Eleanor Sleeth's The Perennian Banditti, I think I said that wrong, and Regina Maria Roche's The Discarded Son or Haunt of Banditti. I chose both Sleeth and Roche because they're actually the novelists that appear in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. And so because they appear in Austen, they always receive a lot of critical attention. Within Anglophone Gothic novels of the late 18th century, banditti gained a visibility, even prominence they may have formerly lacked. But the Gothic aesthetic relegates them to an earlier age and uses this foreign sounding word, banditti, to locate them outside the nation. The association of the Gothic with banditti made them into fantastic or historically distant figures for readers of Gothic novels, but it must also have had the same effect, I think, for readers of contemporary newspapers. The novel's interactions with the news rendered banditti, whether they be Rajas in India, homeless ex-soldiers in London, or rebels in Ireland, as figures from a distant and romantic pre-modern world, when it seems to be that they were more just modern and transnational byproducts of the nation state. However, I'd like to end with 2 brief examples that might serve to complicate my own account. Political pamphlets from the 1790s, an important part of late 18th century print culture that I haven't really had time to discuss today, use the same Gothic aesthetic for a different end. The first example here is from Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, Part 2. And Part 2 is the one that he was tried in absentia for in England and sentenced to death, and he was never able to return. So this one might be more familiar. In an effort to delegitimize the monarchy, Paine writes, quote, "It could have been no difficult thing in the early and solitary ages of the world, while the chief employment of men was that of attending flocks and herds, for a banditti or ruffians to overrun a country and lay it under contributions. Their power being thus established, the chief of the band contrived to lose the name of robber and that of monarch, and hence the origins of monarchy and kings." Also published, and this is a text I just recently read, in 1791, the abolitionist Quabna Adaba Quagano in his Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evils of Slavery. And this is a really amazing text because it's the one example of an abolitionist text by a Black a Black British writer that is not written without any paratext or any sponsorship by a religious society. So it's really interesting. So he uses banditti to critique the institution of slavery in a complicated response to a book written by a West Indian slave owner. Quigano writes, quote, "Perhaps he was afraid that some of his friends, the great and opulent banditti of slaveholders in the western part of the world, might be found guilty of more atrocious and complicated crimes than even those of highwaymen, the robberies and petty larcenies committed in England." These two concluding examples show this same aesthetic being put to very different ends. It seems that Gothic aesthetics could also be deployed against dominant structures, framing monarchy and slavery as outmoded institutions. So that's it.
Thank you, JoEllen, thank you very much for this brilliant talk, so full of ideas and interesting material. Now I just have to remind that if someone wants to address any question to JoEllen or make some observation, you can already inform us by writing in the chat, and then we will give you the word. And I hope that there will be some debate. For my own part, I just want to say that this approach puts the Gothic novels and the literary discourse in general into a new perspective by outlining a romantic era history of banditti that moves across media, genre, and national borders. And I do think that this paper fits perfectly into our project because it sheds light upon the fact that the Gothic moment is indeed a crucial core in the development of a new media system that took place in the first half of the 19th century. So Gothic novels, but also chapbooks, and maybe there's another line with the chapbooks and this kind of literature. The ubiquity of banditti shows precisely the existence of a middle distance in textual and visual representations that is clear in a way that gives us the perception of how banditti function as an aesthetic frame in a global dimension, not only in Italy, in the framework of Italy, but India, Ireland, etc. France. In her talk, JoEllen DeLucia has given us an example of disconnections between aesthetic and media practice, showing the intercultural qualities that the English print culture sought to articulate at the turn of 18th century and after the French Revolution. It is something that we may discuss the role of the French Revolution in engendering a new perspective concerning brigands in politics and in literature, and it's something that we can discuss. And as you may recall, the main objective of our project and our forthcoming conference is to investigate the progressive transition from an ancien regime mediatization to a renewed public communication system. We know that in recent decades, the most innovative international historiography has shown how the roots of media transformation can be traced back to the last part of the 18th century. In a context where new mediatic objects spread their influence, new media such as illustrated books and novels, but also periodicals, feminine periodicals, illustrated periodicals, and later on dioramas, panoramas, pictorial theater, etc. This play a major role in building an intermediate inventory of figures, characters, and these new illustrated media, such as also Gothic novels, create a shared narration of historical events or current affairs, as we have seen, but they were also ready to integrate social types, literary characters, such as Montoni, or criminal celebrities within their references. Therefore, at the turn of the 19th century, within the banditti mania, banditti and brigands became part of a stratified mechanism of cultural construction. And very soon, the figure of the Italian brigand in particular became one of the most pervasive and emblematic icons of the European social imaginary. In this way, I think that JoEllen's talk enters fully into these whirling collective narratives, and it acquires multiplicity of meanings from a political, artistical, aesthetical, and even ethnographical point of view. We can also discuss, JoEllen, the role that this genre, this Gothic discourse plays in shaping the social identities of Italians, Indians, Irishmen, etc. As you can see, I am very happy that JoEllen decided to be part of this project. So I got only 2 questions for you, and then we will go further with the debate. The first question concerns the opacity of the word of banditti and its very etymology. It is true that, for instance, in the Mysteries of Udolpho, the character of Montoni is always ambiguous. We don't really know if it's a condottiero or a brigand, or maybe I suggest maybe both in this frame of historical reception of Italy and in the sublime and romantic atmosphere. But it's also true that this ambiguity is part of the very definition of how Gothic writers perceive the national past of Italy and of a phenomenon, brigandage, which includes in its nature crime and war, pillage and chivalry. But what I like to ask is, from a linguistic point of view, how and when the neologism brigand from the French is put beside the word banditti in English. And more generally, how do you think that Gothic banditti participate in shaping the common idea of crime as a counter society? I'm thinking in particular of the Foucault reflections upon Gothic fiction and the panopticon and so on. When Emily arrives at Udolpho, in this scene, we perceive the haunt of banditti as a republic of crime, which is placed beyond society. I don't think it's clear, but it's a question. The second question is more specific. I was very interested in the juxtaposition between Gothic series like Monks and Robbers and the news report by radical magazines. So are there any connections between the Radcliffe's novels and the ideological function of banditti in novels such as Caleb Williams by William Godwin, and in general in the Republican network, you had quoted Thomas Paine, something like that. Now maybe it's time to let some of our participants step in. I think that we can collect some questions and thoughts, and then if you agree, JoEllen, you can do a closing reply to everybody. So, are there any questions or
yes,
thoughts?
Giulio, okay, may I ask? May I speak? Thank you very much. I wish to thank JoEllen DeLucia for this most interesting talk. I really learned a lot because I work mainly on 19th century military occupations, so something quite different from this topic. I was impressed by a particular part of Edmund Burke's speech, as it was commented by Radcliffe, when it says that it is contagious, it is contagion to approach banditti. Well, it's really, maybe it is not surprising insofar, I mean, the idea of the contagion of revolutionary ideas was quite widespread starting 1789, but also before, starting from the American Revolution. But I found quite stimulating the association of banditry, political banditry, and contagion. It seems to me that the two imaginaries here really overlap, and maybe in Burke, there is a certain consciousness of the popularity of banditry as a public figure derives from this from the new configuration of information that we see at the end of the 18th century. I mean, I think that the rise, the parallel growth of travel and travel literatures and the rise of modern information and information networks played a role in spreading this figure of bandits, and maybe in this association between the contagions of revolutionary ideas and the contagion of banditry, we see a consciousness of this process.
Grazie Alessandro, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? I think that Daniele Di Bartolomeo has a question, but is already in another meeting, so he has written down the question, so I can read it. He says, Daniele, at the end of the 18th century, the French Revolution changes the way of looking at the past. Does this change have consequences in the choice of historical references for the narrative construction of bandits? This is a question from Daniele Di Bartolomeo, who apologized for not being here, but he has read the paper. And another question, are there any relationships between the narrative construction of Italian banditi and that of the thugs, the Indian sect of the thugs? So, non so se c'è qualche altra questione da porre, altrimenti poi lasciamo la parola a JoEllen. So JoEllen, you can reply to these questions.
Okay. Well, this is all really helpful, and I just wanted to say, in general, in an umbrella comment that covers all the questions, they're very helpful for me because a lot of these ideas have always been associated in criticism of British Gothic novels, but it seems to me that it's really helpful for me how the group is coming from a different vantage point and thinking about them in a more historical context and also in a more Italian context. So in terms of that, I guess I would start with the question about crime in Italy that I think Giulio asked, and try to build out a little bit from there. I think that people, of course, The Castle of Otranto, which is supposed to be the first Gothic novel in English by Horace Walpole, which is published in the 1760s, is set in Italy, as is Mysteries of Udolpho, as I believe is, although I haven't read it in forever, Matthew Lewis's The Monk. And Matthew Lewis's The Monk is often thought of within Gothic criticism as the origin of ideas that we have about horror. And Anne Radcliffe's Udolpho is always associated, and later her Italian, those are her two most famous novels, are associated with aesthetic understandings of terror and how terror works. And so it seems to me a really important project to kind of make, and of course Radcliffe's Udolpho, as well as The Monk, was translated into all of the European languages very quickly. And it was very, very popular. And I know more about its reception in France than in Italy, unfortunately. But so I think that it is important to restore these fictions as having a lot to do with perceptions of Italy and crime. Most Gothic criticism spends a lot of time in thinking about Catholicism and the way in which British people perceived Catholicism and superstition and all of these kinds of things. But it seems to me that there's a similar story that has yet to be maybe fully developed about crime. And in Alessandro's comment about contagion, Gothic fiction is often thought of as about contagion. So I think you're absolutely right. All the things that you said about the way in which developing media networks, and correct me if I didn't follow this correctly, that the developing media networks, there was this kind of contagion of ideas that people were worried about, right? And then that gets associated in many ways with the banditti. So I mean, I think that's also very right. And it had me thinking about terror, but I'm going to say something about that in a minute. In terms of the brigand, I don't know the answer to that question yet, because I haven't done that same work on that word as I have on banditti. But I will be interested to find out, and I can take it to these same corpuses of text and perhaps let you know. But it was making me recall that the origins of this article that I've written and the research I've done in the banditti, I had an idea maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I haven't fully followed through on before I decided to write just on George Robinson's media network, that I would write a book about statelessness in 18th century English text, and that they would revolve around particular words that seem to develop a new currency or make their way into English around the same time. And of course, banditti was one of those words, but the other words I thought a lot about was the word refugee, that comes into English when the French Huguenots leave France, I think at the end of the 17th century. And also, of course, as I'm sure everybody here knows much more about than I do, the way that the word terrorist comes out of the French Revolution. And also there's one other one I was always thinking of. Vagabond is another word that I don't know as much about. I think that's older than the earlier ones, but I had intended to think about, instead of reading text, and this comes out of media theory, instead of doing close readings of individual texts, I would read across genres and media forms to try to give these figures a depth that they lack in the novels that I read. Brigand in the 18th century, I don't think had the same currency as those other words, but I really haven't done the work to be able to fully answer that question. And I think, did I forget something? Oh, in terms of a radical network, which I think is also related to the contagion question, which I pretty much only half answered. I think more work needs to be done on the position of Radcliffe and some of these other Gothic novelists within print culture, because of course, not only is Radcliffe's husband working for the daily, the Gazetteer and Daily Advertiser was one of the most radical newspapers of the period. He left it in 1793, which was no accident, I think, when thinking with what's going on with the French Revolution. But it was unapologetic in its just absolute support of the French Revolution, very critical of Edmund Burke. And that connected him to likely people like George Robinson, who is another radical publisher I've also studied, as well as, I think in my previous work, I talked about that, how that connects to William Godwin and others. So that's my initial response to those questions. And I have to say for the final question about the Italian banditti and the Indian banditti, this is something I just have to do much more work on. I just discovered this reference maybe a couple weeks ago, so I really haven't had the time to read about the East India Company, Hastings trial, and other things. I know there's actually an article that I found that I have not yet read on banditti and nabobs in colonial India. So if someone wanted to follow up on that, that would be a really good starting place.
Yeah, this is something also in the satirical point of view, the Indian Eastern Company and the banditti. But also, speaking of satirical point of view, the general reception of the robbers from Germany. Maybe this is another little question, then we can close. How do you think that the Räuberroman production enters in connection with not only Anne Radcliffe's novels, but more generally with the Gothic discourse?
I don't know as much about the theater as I should. I do know that her novel was adapted to the stage in at least 2 different variations, and that there are a couple plays that aren't direct adaptations of Udolpho that do even have banditti in the title. What's interesting about them is that some of them are comedies. And so I think that's also important, and it adds a whole other dimension to all the things I've been talking about today, because of course, comedy, a completely different aesthetic than horror and terror. Terror is the aesthetic that's most closely associated with Radcliffe.
Yeah, indeed. Se non ci sono altre questioni, altre domande...
Giulio, forse io, se mi aiuti. So, dear colleague, sorry, but my English is so awful that I asked to Giulio to translate me.
It's so much better than my Italian, so please don't apologize.
It's about Montori, il personaggio di Montori, e mi sembra di capire che Radcliffe salvaguarda l'eroismo di questo personaggio, distinguendo tra banditi e condottieri. E fa una specificazione, il narratore fa una specificazione che da una parte ci fa capire che lei è cosciente, la Radcliffe è cosciente, è consapevole della differenza che ci può essere tra i banditi che si trovano sui giornali, Indian banditi, Irish banditi, e il condottiero dell'Italia del Cinquecento. E la domanda è, a suo parere, perché cerca di salvaguardare l'eroismo di questo personaggio, che è un personaggio terribile?
Agnese, forse sopravvaluti le mie capacità, ma ci provo. Agnese Silvestri, which is a part of the scientific committee, so I'm very grateful for her question, asks if why does Anne Radcliffe preserves the certain traces of heroism in Montoni, in the character of Montoni, by distinguishing the word condottieri from the word banditi, in a way that reminds the historical Renaissance Italy, while banditi, Indian banditi and Irish banditi are evil figures. So, yeah. Non lo so se ho rispettato proprio il criterio, ma ci proviamo.
Well, this is something I need to think much more about in the longer version of this character, because this paper, because Montoni is such a big deal. Some people think Montoni is a predecessor of how like Byron is depicted later on, and he's a really important figure in British print culture. There is in the novel, for those of you who may have read it, just this strange admiration for Montoni and his self-command. And his self-command and his stoicism is always in many ways associated with the heroine, actually, who's also very good at controlling her emotions and like keeping it together when all of these terrible things are happening. So I haven't quite puzzled through that, but I do think the references to the condottieri, who I do not know much about and need to learn more about, is a vestige or like part of that. And I thought it was an interesting moment to put in conversation with the example from the Hastings trial, because there seems to be the same uncertainty surrounding Montoni and what's motivating his actions, whether he's not clearly good or bad. Another figure in literature who people say Montoni was very influential on was Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. I don't know if anyone has ever read Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. So there is this strange admiration of him, and I don't think anyone has ever thought of that admiration for him through a historical lens, where someone thinks about the condottieri and the historical unevenness of the novel, because British literary criticism of British novels has always read the banditti and all of these other figures as just metaphors, just metaphors for psychological states and the individual traumas of the heroines or something like that. So for example, Montoni and Emily, the heroine, are often read as doppelgangers. And so people will think about their relationship in that way. But I don't think too many people have really thought, including myself, until I started to go down this road, have thought a lot about the what kind of Italian history Radcliffe may have been reading, what she knew, things like that. I have to read Piazzi's travel narrative and some other sources that Radcliffe would have encountered.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, JoEllen. I do think that Montoni is a character that reminds us the influence of Friedrich Schiller, Friedrich Schiller's robbers, and the way that Radcliffe has to build an icon of sublime evil, which is connected to the sublime idea of the Italian past. So banditi and condottieri are not so the differences between these two words are not so clear. As a matter of fact, Radcliffe, after this quote that you have quoted, says that condottieri became brigands in the aftermath of wars. So there's a certain overlap between these identities, and I do think that this is part of the brigand identity and the banditi identity. So I think that Montoni is a condottieri and a banditi. I don't know if it's clear, but it's what I think. So if there are no other questions,
May I ask you all one question that will reveal my ignorance of Italian? I wanted to be able to go to like whatever the Italian version of the Oxford English Dictionary might be, to look up the word banditi, B-A-N-D-I-T-I, and just see its origins and how it was used in Italian. I just wondered if someone could help me with that, because I was feeling very ignorant and wondered what sort of connotations that has in Italy versus in English text, in Italian versus in English text.
Yeah, this is a tricky question because I think that in Italian it's more simple because bandito is someone who is banished for their crime, and also it maintains a certain warfare tradition because brigands, banditi participate in this dimension of Renaissance war. But we have here some early modern historian who can reply much better than myself. But in a linguistic way, I think that the appropriation, the English way of it's something different and more very more general. In the English dictionaries of 18th century, we can see banditi used as a synonym of smuggler, thief. So it's something we may discuss in some other circumstance and with some putting some force on that. So, se non ci sono altre questioni, altre domande, once again I thank you very much, JoEllen. It was an important appointment for us. Thank you once again for your talk and for your participation in the entire project. E auguro quindi a tutti e a tutte un buon pomeriggio. Spero che sia stato qualche cosa di utile per tutti quanti.